The snow carried more silence than hope across the frozen plains of the Montana Territory. It was the winter of 1885, and the land had been locked in the iron grip of a blizzard for weeks. The sun hung pale and toothless in the white sky, offering no warmth to the earth that had turned as hard as iron. Drifts piled against the sides of abandoned homesteads, burying the skeletal remains of dreams that had frozen and died under the harsh reality of the northern frontier. Mai stood on the porch of her weathered cabin, one hand shielding her eyes from the blinding glare of the snow, the other gripping the icy railing until her knuckles turned white. At 23, she looked far too young to carry the weight of the world, her face carved by grief and hardship into something beautiful but severe, like a porcelain doll that had survived a fire. Her dark hair, once worn loose, was now pulled back in a severe, practical bun, though a few strands escaped to whip against her cheeks in the biting wind. Beneath her heavy wool coat, she wore a traditional cheongsam of deep crimson silk, a garment that had traveled thousands of miles and was the last vestige of the life she had left behind. Though her husband, Arthur, had been dead for nearly 8 months now, the accident had been swift and merciless. Arthur had been felling timber in the ridge when the chain snapped. They said he didn't suffer, but Mai knew that was just something people said to widows, particularly foreign ones they didn't know how to comfort. In one moment, she had gone from wife to widow, from protected to protector, with 40 acres of stubborn, frozen land and a 4-year-old son to feed. "Mama, the chickens are quiet," young Kai called from the coop, his voice high and worried. He had his father's sandy hair but his mother's almond-shaped, dark eyes. Eyes that had seen too much for a child his age. "They are just cold, Bao-bei," Mai replied, using the term of endearment instinctively, though she knew it was more than the cold. The feed was running low, and she would have to make another trip to the shed to ration what was left. Every trip into the snow felt like tempting fate. One slip, one hidden patch of ice, and Kai would be an orphan. She made her way to the coop, her boots crunching on the packed snow. The air burned her lungs as she checked the water trough, breaking the ice with a heavy stone. It was freezing over again as fast as she cleared it. Without water, the cattle would die. Without cattle, she would have nothing to sell come spring. Without money, she pushed the thought away. The 20 head of Hereford she kept were already showing ribs through their winter coats. They stood listlessly in the shelter of the trees, their breath clouding in the frigid air. She had already lost 3 calves this season, their small bodies claimed by the unforgiving freeze. Each loss was a nail in the coffin of her independence. "Mrs. Miller," a voice made her jump. Percival Finch, the bank's representative, stood at her gate, his horse puffing steam. He was a thin man, bundled in furs that looked too expensive for a simple clerk, with the predatory patience of a vulture. He always appeared when folks were at their weakest. "Mr. Finch," she acknowledged, not moving to invite him closer. "The pass is treacherous." "What brings you out?" "Concern for your welfare," he said, touching his hat in a gesture that might have seemed gentlemanly if not for the calculating gleam in his eyes as he looked at her exotic dress peeking from her coat. "The bank has been reviewing accounts, and with your husband gone, well, a woman alone, especially one not from these parts, perhaps you'd consider selling. I could arrange a fair price, enough to set you up nice in San Francisco. Maybe find your own kind." "This is my son's inheritance," she said firmly, her accent slight but present. "I will not sell." Finch's smile tightened. "The next payment is due in 2 months. Mrs. Miller, I do hope you'll have it. The winter is long, and accidents happen." He turned his horse and left. After he was gone, Mai allowed herself a moment of weakness, leaning against the frozen wood of the gate. The gossip in town was getting worse. A Chinese widow trying to run a ranch was unusual enough, but one who refused to sell to the local baron was positively scandalous. Just last Sunday, Mrs. Gable had made a point of pulling her skirts away when Mai walked into the general store, as if her heritage might be contagious. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue. When she spotted the rider, he appeared as a dark speck against the glowing snow, moving slowly. Both horse and man were clearly exhausted. Mai's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle propped against the porch rail. Strangers were rarely good news, especially for a woman alone in the dead of winter. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. The horse was a black gelding, coat matted with ice and favoring its left front leg. The rider sat tall despite his obvious fatigue, broad shoulders bent forward, hat pulled low against the wind. His clothes marked him as a working man, heavy sheepskin coat, worn leather chaps, a scarf that covered most of his face. He stopped a respectful distance from the house, pushing back his hat to reveal a face that might have been handsome under the layer of travel grime and beard stubble. His eyes were the color of the winter sky, pale blue, almost grey. "Evening," he said, his voice rough from cold and disuse. "Name's Colton Bridger. I'm sorry to trouble you, but my horse has gone lame about 5 miles back. I was wondering if I might trouble you for a place to wait out the night. I can pay for the inconvenience." I studied him carefully. His gun belt was worn but well maintained, the mark of a man who took his protection seriously but didn't treat it as a toy. His hands rested easy on the saddle horn, gloved and steady. There was something in his manner, a quiet respectfulness despite his rough appearance, that eased her immediate suspicion. "There is a stall in the barn," she said finally. "Though it is cold. I have no extra blankets." "I'm handy with horses," Colton said. "I can manage if you've got a roof. And if you got any work needs doing, I'd be glad to trade labor for a warm meal. Been living on jerky and snow water for too long." Kai had crept onto the porch, peering around his mother's silk skirts at the stranger. Colton noticed him and touched his hat brim in a gentle greeting that made the boy duck back shyly. "Fine boy you've got there," Colton observed. "About my nephew's age." The mention of family eased another fraction of Mai's weariness. Outlaws and drifters rarely spoke of kin. "The barn is to the left," she repeated. "There is a pump inside, but you must heat the water. Supper is at sunset. Nothing fancy, just rice and stew." After 3 weeks in the drift, rice and stew sounds like a feast fit for kings. He dismounted carefully, favoring his left side in a way that suggested an old injury rather than fresh hurt. As he led his horse toward the barn, Mai noticed the careful way he moved, alert, but not aggressive. "Mama," Kai whispered, tugging at the silk of her cheongsam. "Is he staying?" "Just for supper," Mai said firmly, though something in her chest felt strangely tight as she watched the stranger disappear into the barn's shadow. The sunset painted everything in shades of gold and blood, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have help again. But that was dangerous thinking for a widow. She had learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when survival took everything she had. Tomorrow, the stranger would move on, and she would face another day of keeping the bank, the cold, and Thaddeus Thorne at bay with nothing but her own 2 hands. Still, as she headed inside to start supper, she found herself adding extra potatoes to the stew and checking that there was enough tea for a hungry traveler. The morning sun crept through the frosted cabin window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Mai had been awake since before dawn. The knowledge that a stranger slept in her barn added an edge of alertness to her usual routine. She watched him through the window as he emerged from the barn, breaking the ice on the trough to wash his face. When he looked toward the house, she stepped back quickly, heat rising in her cheeks at being caught watching. "Is the man still here?" Kai asked from his small bed. "Mr. Bridger," she corrected automatically. "And yes." He fixed the hinge on the gate. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Colton standing respectfully back from the threshold. "Morning, Mrs. Miller. I wanted to thank you for the hospitality and settle up what I owe before moving on. You mended the gate and chopped wood," Mai said. "We are square." He studied her for a moment, those pale eyes seeing more than she liked. "That roof needs work before the next heavy snow. So does the corral fence. And unless I miss my guess, those cattle need to be moved to the lower pasture where the windbreak is, or they'll freeze standing up." All true, and all things she had been putting off, lacking the strength to manage them alone. "That is not your concern, Mr. Bridger." Could be, though he shifted his weight. "I'm not in any particular hurry. If you could use a hand for a few days, I work for food and a place to lay my head." that barn's dry enough." I knew she should refuse. Curtains had probably twitched in town when he rode in, but the list of repairs grew longer each day. "I cannot pay wages," she said stiffly. Didn't ask for any. He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll start with the roof." And so began an arrangement that I told herself would last only a few days. But those days stretched into a week, then two. Colton Bridger proved to be everything he had promised, a hard worker who knew his business and kept a respectful distance. He ate his meals with them but excused himself quickly after, returning to the barn. It was Kai who first broke through Colton's reserve. The boy had taken to following him around like a shadow. "Were you in the war?" Kai asked one evening as they sat by the fire. The question made me stiffen, but Colton just nodded slowly. "I was just a boy myself. Not much older than your mama was then, I reckon." "Did you fight bad men?" Kai scolded gently. But Colton held up a hand. "It's a fair question. Yes, son. I did. And it's nothing I take pride in. War makes men do things they spend the rest of their lives trying to forget." I saw the shadows cross his face and understood a little of what had put that bone-deep weariness in his eyes. The next morning brought trouble in the form of 3 riders from town. I recognized them immediately, ranch gentry, who enforced for the local land baron, accompanied by 2 hired guns. She smoothed her silk cheongsam, threw her heavy coat over her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch. "Gentlemen," she said coolly. "What brings you out?" Gentry, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow and a cruel smile, spoke first. "Heard you got yourself a hired man, Widow Miller." "A drifter." "I have help with repairs." "Yes." "Living in your barn, eating at your table," Gentry sneered. "People are talking." "A white man serving a Chinese woman? It ain't right." "I have yet to see a people bring hay or mend fences," I replied, her voice sharp as the winter wind. Gentry stepped forward, his expression darkening. "We're concerned for the community's moral standing. Thaddeus Thorne doesn't like it. He thinks it's time you moved on." "What I think," I began, but stopped as Colton appeared around the corner of the house, a heavy axe in his hand. "Gentlemen," Colton said mildly, but something in his stance made the men shift uneasily. "Fine morning, isn't it? I was just about to split more wood. Unless you're here to help, I'd best get to it." "We're just delivering a message," Gentry spat, hand hovering near his pistol. "Message delivered," Colton replied. "And I'm sure Mrs. Miller appreciates neighbors who mind her welfare so closely. Now, get off the property." There was a moment of tense silence. Colton stood relaxed but ready, and I realized with a start that despite his easy manner, this was a man who had faced down worse than 3 town bullies. "This ain't over," Gentry snarled, backing his horse away. "Watch your back, drifter." After they left, I found her hands were shaking. "They will make trouble." "Maybe," Colton agreed. "But bullies usually back down when faced directly. If my presence causes you grief, I will move on." "No," I said quickly. "There is still work to be done." That evening, the temperature dropped drastically. The cattle were in danger. "We'll lose them all if we don't move them to the canyon," Colton said, watching the thermometer. "The wind chill will kill them by morning." "The canyon is 5 miles through the drifts," I said, wrapping her arms around herself. "We go together or not at all," Colton said. They left within the hour. I rode her sturdy mare, while Colton handled Arthur's gelding. The drive was a nightmare of ice and wind. The cattle moved reluctantly, their bellows lost in the howling gale. As they reached the narrow pass leading to the canyon shelter, a shot rang out. Colton threw himself at Mai, pulling her from her saddle into a snowbank just as a bullet shattered the air where she had been. "Stay down!" Colton roared, drawing his revolver and firing back at the muzzle flashes in the rocks above. It was Gentry and his men. They had been waiting. Mai crawled to her rifle, her heart pounding against her ribs. She fired blindly into the rocks, providing cover as Colton moved with lethal grace, flanking the attackers. The gunfight was brief and brutal. Colton's aim was true, wounding one man and sending the others scrambling for their horses. "Pull back!" Gentry shouted. "Pull back!" When silence returned, only the wind howled. Colton slid down the embankment, holstering his smoking gun. He grabbed his eyes wild with adrenaline and fear. "Are you hit?" he demanded, tearing at her coat to check for blood. "I am fine." "You saved me," she gasped. The storm was intensifying, a true blizzard now. "We can't make it back," Colton yelled over the wind. "We have to shelter in the line shack." They drove the cattle into the canyon and fought their way to the small, abandoned shack Arthur had built years ago. Inside, it was freezing, but out of the wind. Colton got a fire going in the small stove while Mai shivered uncontrollably, the shock and cold setting in. "Come here," Colton said, pulling a blanket around them both. They huddled together on the rough floorboards, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. The proximity was overwhelming. Mai could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of gunpowder, snow, and man. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. "Why?" she whispered. "Why risk your life for a stranger? For a farm that isn't yours?" Colton looked down at her, his hand coming up to brush a snowflake from her hair. His thumb lingered on her cheek. "Because since the moment I rode into your yard, I haven't wanted to be anywhere else. Because you fight like a tiger for this land." Mai leaned into his touch. "Everyone else sees a foreigner. A helpless widow." "I see a queen," Colton murmured. "I see a woman who carries the weight of the world in silk and wool." The air between them crackled, hotter than the stove. The danger outside, the near-death experience, stripped away the pretenses of propriety. "Colton," she breathed. He groaned low in his throat. His lips brushed her ear, sending shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "God help me, Mai. I've been trying to be a gentleman. But being this close to you—" "Don't be a gentleman," she whispered, turning her face to his. His mouth found hers, hungry and desperate. It was a kiss of survival, of two broken souls finding the matching pieces in the dark. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "I've driven cattle from Texas to Montana," he whispered against her lips, his voice raw with emotion. "I've seen gold in the hills and sunsets that would break your heart. But I swear to you, Mai, I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside you." The words were rough, earthy, and undeniably honest. They cut through Mai's defenses like a hot knife. She didn't want poetry, she wanted him. She wanted the man who stood between her and the wolves. "Then trade them," she whispered back. The blizzard raged outside, burying the world in white, but inside the shack, there was only fire and heat. Morning brought a break in the storm and a new reality. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, a shared understanding. However, as they crested the ridge overlooking the homestead, Mai's heart stopped. "Smoke! Kai!" she screamed, kicking her horse into a gallop. The barn was a smoldering ruin. The house was still standing, but scorch marks licked the side. Neighbors, Olaf Jensen and his wife, were already there, throwing buckets of snow on the steaming embers. Mai threw herself off her horse. "Kai! Where is my son?" "He is safe," Mrs. Jensen called out, stepping away from the porch where Kai was wrapped in a blanket, soot-streaked but unharmed. "We saw the smoke." "Gentry! We saw him riding away." Mai collapsed to her knees, clutching her son. Colton stood behind her, his face a mask of cold fury. "This ends now," he said. "They have money, power," Mai said, looking at the ruins of the barn. "We have nothing." "We have the truth," Colton said. "And we have neighbors who saw what happened." The confrontation happened 2 days later at the town hall. Thaddeus Thorne had called an emergency meeting, claiming Mai was unfit to hold the land, citing the fire as proof of negligence and her cohabitation with a drifter as moral turpitude. The courtroom was packed. Thorne sat with his lawyers, looking smug. Percival Finch sat nearby, clutching foreclosure papers. "This woman cannot manage the property," Thorne declared. "For the safety of the community and the boy, the land should be auctioned. I am prepared to buy it." "The fire was arson," Mai said, standing tall in her crimson cheongsam, a striking figure of defiance. "Said by your men." "Outrageous accusations from a desperate woman," Thorne scoffed. "Do you have proof?" "I do," a voice boomed. Olaf Jensen stepped forward. "I saw Rance Gentry throwing the torch. I saw him riding from the Miller place." "The word of an immigrant farmer," Thorne sneered. "And what about the word of a Texas Ranger?" Colton stepped forward from the back of the room. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tin badge, pinning it to his chest. A gasp went through the room. "Colton Bridger," he announced. "I've been tracking Rance Gentry for murder in Abilene for 6 months. Found him here, doing your dirty work, Thorne." Thorne's face went pale. I didn't know." "You hired him," Colton said, his voice